Depression is a tough subject to cover. It's among the most common of mental illnesses, yet despite that, we still struggle with accepting it as a prevalent health concern. Not to mention, the general public's understanding of depression still leaves a lot to be desired. As such, depicting a common yet often misunderstood condition like depression in media can be a daunting task. Movies and television try this from time to time, with the results ranging from interesting, if confused, art house flicks to insufferable exploitive trash. Video games and how they handle depression fares a bit worse than even film, with examples ranging from titles that use it for an element of a larger message to ones that throw it in haphazardly in an attempt to spice up their story. Not a great track record. However, among the crop of lackluster examples, one game actually managed to get a lot of the beats right. The Cat Lady was released in 2012 and developed by Harvester Games, though this studio is primarily spearheaded by one Rem Mikulski. It follows the story of Susan Ashworth, a middle-aged woman with severe depression who kills herself in the game's opening moments. After waking up in some kind of afterlife, Susan meets the enigmatic Queen of Maggots, who gives Susan a gift and a task. She's granted effective immortality through the powers of resurrection, but in return, Susan must kill 5 parasites for the Queen. The parasites are a bunch of over-the-top serial killer characters who all come looking for Susan themselves in time. After taking the deal with the figurative devil, Susan wakes up in the hospital having been saved from her latest suicide attempt at the very last minute. The game then follows Susan as she gets out of the ward, fights some Batman villains, tries to return to her day-to-day grind, makes a new friend who has her own hang-ups to deal with, and finally confronts the course of events that led to her attempt at suicide. As a story, The Cat Lady is primarily a character piece, mainly centering on Susan herself and her friend Mitzi, though what stood out most to me and many others about the game's story is how well it depicts someone living with depression. It does so without coming off as a lecture, and more importantly, not exploitative of the subject matter either. For a video game, that's a rare feat. Now, obviously, I'm by no means an expert, an adept, or even an educated voice on this subject matter. I'm just some dumbass who enjoys this game and giving poor surface level readings into the meaning of stories in general. So all of my knowledge of medical depression is beyond rudimentary and should be taken with a grain of salt. With that out of the way, we can start off by going over 6 of the 9 major symptoms that point towards depression, as outlined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition and International Classification of Diseases 10th edition. These 6 are all traits that Susan shows throughout the Cat Lady. Susan's generally flat tone of voice and demeanor fits the bill here, as in dialogue she rarely emotes heavily beyond mild irritation with others. Her general apathetic attitude fits as well, since Susan seems to lack an interest in much of anything going on around her for a good chunk of the game, barely reacting to things as minor as her favorite mug breaking to as major as seeing her own dead body lying in front of her. The game gives us precious few details about what exactly Susan enjoys, since she isn't exactly vocal about the subject, which in turn keeps the audience mostly ignorant. What is worth noting though is how, while she doesn't like talking about what she enjoys, she is all too eager to bring up what she hates. While she isn't at a loss for interest in things in general, she sure as hell lacks an interest in anything pleasurable. Susan comments at one point how she's gone days without eating and has to be reminded by Mitzi to do so later on. In the 4th chapter, Susan remarks how, in the day after she got out of the psych ward, she slept all night and through most of the day. Both excessive sleep and insomnia can be red flags for depression, and outside of one optional dialogue choice, this is the one time Susan brings up her sleeping habits. This is definitely the most on the nose of all the symptoms. After all, the game opens with Susan's own suicide attempt, so this is thrown right in the player's face from the get-go. It's also implied in the 3rd chapter that she had been contemplating jumping off a bridge sometime before the game's events. Susan sees herself as useless, openly stating this at one point. However, what truly matters here is the detail about excessive guilt, which directly ties to the source of Susan's depressed state. About a decade prior to the events of the game, Susan was a married mother with a baby girl. One night, while having an argument with her insanely petty husband, the two failed to notice that the girl was having an allergic reaction to the flowers placed in her room earlier in the day. It was a rare allergy to pollen that neither could have possibly known about, but both played just enough of a role in the events that it would make sense for them to entirely blame themselves. This resulted in her husband killing himself and Susan spending a decade living with the fallout. With how seeing things like flowers can immediately trigger a panicked response from Susan, among other things, it's clear that Susan still feels immense guilt over what was not remotely her fault. This is all a 101 reading list, but the reason I went over how Susan's behavior and actions match the direct symptoms so closely is to point out how the cat lady never comes across as trying to educate you on the basics. We see the symptoms through her actions and, in context, see them as traits of a fully realized character rather than notes on a checklist that the writer needs to cross off to get their point across. In short, Susan Ashworth isn't simply a vessel for portraying a person with depression. She's an actual character, and the game is more interested in showing the audience her story and arc rather than explaining all the specifics of depression to them. Now, these are only just the basics, as the cat lady doesn't just stop at these when depicting Susan's struggles. Anxiety is the most common comorbid condition of depression, and we see firsthand in one of the most interesting sections of the cat lady that Susan clearly suffers from both. The goal of Chapter 3 is for Susan to simply conduct basic tasks around her apartment, having a quick and easy meal, a shower, a smoke and coffee, things like that. The catch is, Susan has to do all of these things while avoiding anything at all that might stress her out and set off an anxiety attack. This is depicted in-game through a riff on the old red and blue morality meters seen in a lot of video games, with the blue representing Susan's contentment for small pleasures, and the red bar being her stress caused from stimuli as small as a crow sitting on her desk, to as large as seeing her child's teddy bear just lying around. As others have pointed out, the really clever bit of the system is how the blue bar's progress doesn't negate the red bar's, and how the red bar raises significantly faster than the blue. Having played through the game multiple times now, I've never actually beaten this chapter without Susan having an anxiety attack at the end. It's extremely difficult to not come into contact with things so minor that nonetheless add up to push her over the edge. As others such as Ragnarox have commented on in his own video on the cat lady, link in the description below, this chapter actually portrays the difficulty of almost hopelessly attempting to avoid anxiety attacks very well. Another aspect of depression and anxiety is how those suffering with either or both develop increasingly avoidant personalities. To quote, "Given the central role that social interactions typically play in our lives, individuals who are more socially anxious and engage in experiential avoidance behaviors may not come into contact with potential sources of reinforcement, contributing to depressed mood." To put it simply, again speaking from a point of general ignorance, Susan's largest hindrance to any sort of recovery is her utter lack of a support network. No matter what the player chooses for her familial background, Susan's parents are not a part of her life by the game's events. Both her daughter and her husband are long dead, and according to Susan herself, everyone in her apartment complex hates her. Even when someone like Mitzi practically forces herself into Susan's life, she rebukes her at every attempt until eventually conceding out of sheer exhaustion in the face of Mitzi's exceeding optimism. It is possible that Susan's initial rejection of Mitzi and the broad depiction of her neighbors as spiteful towards her is linked with another comorbid trait of depression, paranoia. Emotional and traumatic memories are linked with the afflicted's internal and external senses of shame, which both positively correlate to depression and paranoia. To sum up, internal and external shame are defined in these ways. Internal shame may be associated with the belief that one has not lived up to one's personal value system in the context of one's thoughts, behavior, or appearance. It results in a devaluation of one's self-concept, a belief that one is less worthy, less capable, weak, or inadequate. External shame involves the judgment of others which, if accepted or internalized, becomes internal shame as well. People brought down by internal and external shame report more depressive symptoms than those without. In turn, those with high levels of paranoid belief also experience similar types of external and internal shame. While just a correlation, it is a link between paranoia and depression in some capacity. Susan displays paranoid beliefs and behaviors in a number of ways. She holds irrational ideas like how everyone in her apartment would want to burn her at the stake, yet only 2 of them seem to harbor any sort of negative affects towards her. She initially sees Mitzi as a direct threat to herself, despite most of the signs pointing to the exact opposite. Well, keyword, most. As a result, she tries to violently push her out of her life. Mitzi only sticks around due to her own unyielding optimism, but it's easy to see how her behavior prior to the game's events, shutting out others due to paranoid fears of judgment or harm they may cause her, would result in Susan being almost entirely alone. That seclusion leaves her isolated, without a support network, and left alone to stew in her own misery due to the power her paranoid thoughts have over her. It's this kind of mess that allows the cat lady's true core antagonist to worm her way into Susan's life. An enigmatic figure that appears infrequently but looms large over the game's events. So, what exactly is the Queen of Maggots anyway? Well, she's a supernatural entity who holds power over her own otherworld-esque afterlife, and has the ability to bring people back from the dead. She rejects direct titles, preferring to keep it vague with lines like, "I have so many names." The Queen of Maggots also attempts to single out Susan during their initial conversation, sowing seeds of distrust within Susan by saying that people who may attempt to befriend her could be parasites that simply just wish to kill her. She attempts to convince Susan that her life would be much better if she just listened to the Queen's influence, and frequently throws in reminders of Susan's past traumas within her dream worlds to further put her on edge. Memories of her husband, her perceptions of her neighbors, her baby's death, and her own suicide. The Queen of Maggots portrays herself as a godlike, powerful figure, yet outside of the resurrection power, she's largely impotent. The Queen can't actually blow out the candles that trade lives herself, needing someone who has already died to do so. She can't actually kill any of the supposed parasites herself, needing to send others out to do it for her. In general, the Queen is unable to actually influence things with her own actions, requiring others to act on her behalf. In this case, Susan. How does she do this? Through verbal manipulation. The Queen of Maggots takes the vulnerable and coerces them by whispering doubt into their ears. Doubt others, doubt themselves, and doubt their ability to live without her. "You need me," she tells Susan towards the end. "We are one." With this in mind, and taking into account the general themes of the Cat Lady, it would be easy to label the Queen of Maggots as the embodiment of depression, but this is too simple and ignores other details within the game. Mitzi, for instance, is marked by the Queen, yet there isn't any real implication that she has depression. Instead, I think that the Queen of Maggots is an embodiment of a bit of a broader idea, one I'm struggling to give a single name to, honestly. The best names I can put to it are rot or stagnation. Even then, it's not perfect, so let's try explaining it a little. With Mitzi, she was willing to throw away what little of her life she had left, all for revenge. The reason she wanted to stay with Susan so bad is that she could plan a murder-suicide act to kill the man who pushed her boyfriend to suicide, who lived in the same apartment complex. When her and Susan first met, Mitzi revealed how she had cancer, and while she did say she didn't have much longer to live, she never said it was diagnosed as terminal. Instead, Mitzi rejected treatment, and in my opinion, she did so to solely focus on getting that sweet, sweet taste of revenge against some message board griefer. In other words, she gives up on life, and while it's a dramatic example of this, Susan's direct interactions with the Queen of Maggots takes a similar tone. As we went over, the Queen is more than happy to throw Susan's past experiences in her face to better convince Susan to not change herself for the better or turn her situation around. Her message is essentially to never try, never improve, but to instead wallow in self-loathing, isolation from and hatred of the world, the vague and nebulous they that are always poised against her. Settle, give up, or in other words, stagnate. In her final confrontation with the Queen, Susan herself realizes this. She identifies the Queen as the bitter guilt, self-pity, and the illness that's been plaguing her entire life. However, Susan also realizes something, that for all of the Queen's pomp and circumstance, she truly is powerless on her own. When presented with a sadistic choice at the game's end, Susan instead decides to reject both options given to her and understands that the self-destructive voice the Queen gives life to only has the power that Susan herself gave it. In the end, she makes the active choice to take the power back, and in turn frees herself from the Queen's influence. Regardless of the good endings the player receives, Susan reaches a similar conclusion, which I'd argue is the cat lady's take-home message. While depression and the nagging desire to just give up may be debilitating, it is not unbeatable. Susan begins making effort in her life again. She goes out more, recreates a form of support network, and finding a purpose in life beyond herself. Susan herself acknowledges that, while she may be having a smooth period currently, those times won't last forever, and she'll more than likely never truly be rid of her depression. However, while fully admitting that, she decides to stay on her new path. She forgives herself, the world, and remains confident that one day she will reach some sort of lasting peace. So it is the first video back since our hiatus, and yeah, I said I wasn't going to do these end cards very often, but this one's kind of necessary. This is a script I'm working on for like 6-7 months now, at the time of recording anyway, and I was not happy with it. I just let it sit for almost half a year. I want nothing to do with it. Because it's flawed. It's not a great script, absolutely not my best work, and you'll probably notice that. It's very, very gimmicky, the way I kind of like list symptoms. I straight up lost some of the articles I use as a source, specifically the one I even quote. That's embarrassing. Like, that's a guaranteed F right there. It's terrible. And even some of the video stuff that I put together here, pretty flawed, but I think specifically putting Silent Hill 2 next to the whole depressed games category, it almost implies, like, I think lesser of Silent Hill 2, which could not be further from the truth. Believe me, that is probably my favorite game, ever. But to the point. Not my best work, but you know what? Not everyone is going to be. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and in general, I might want to look at the developer Remikolski's games in the future. He's an interesting guy. I find his style pretty, if not always successful, it's always interesting, and I'm always glad to have played his games at the end. All three of the trilogy of these games. The other two, Downfall and Lorelei, I'm very glad to have played them. So yeah, hopefully I'll check those out in the future, and in the meantime, I hope you enjoy. We will hopefully be back at a more regular upload schedule, and yeah, go from there.